Hello and welcome to Let's H. I'm Ushjo, your host. Check out the blurb below, click on the read more, and check out those links. One of them is my comic Occultus, which has paranormal investigation and hot guys. You're gonna love it. Check it out. Follow me on social media, subscribe to me on this channel, and become a patron on Patreon for other bonuses. So last time, when I was doing a review, we had American Horror Story, Freak Show. I loved the first episode. Didn't quite love the rest of the series so much, but very much enjoyed the ending. Overall, the series was highly problematic, and I can't give it a recommendation, but I thought about it and I thought maybe it would be more useful for me to talk about how I felt the series fell short and make suggestions about what they might have done better. At one point, I woke up from a sound sleep, and my mind was racing about all the things that I should talk about regarding Freak Show. So I'm going to try and remember them here. Can I do it? We'll see. So my first and possibly most significant complaint is the fact that the writing is so inconsistent. I've said this before. American Horror Story has a problem with writing, direction, and consistency. It's more visible when you actually sit down and watch the series, especially if you do it like I did in short order. But honestly, even with a weekly gap, like when I was watching Hotel in real time, it still shows very obviously. These seasons are only 12, maybe 13 episodes. There's no reason why one single person can't write all of the scripts. There's no reason why one single person can't direct all of the episodes. Or if you don't want to do that, at least have the same team doing it. But that's not what happens here. One person writes this episode, the next episode is written by another person. This person directs this episode, and someone else directs this episode. If people would work together and have more of a concrete, coherent idea of what they want to do with a story, it'll come off as much better. When you look at American Horror Story, any of the seasons, it looks like they have no idea what they want to do with it from the beginning. Which, as I said, is problematic because it's only 12 or 13 episodes. In terms of television series, that's not really all that much. There's no real need for it to be as incoherent and have such an utter lack of cohesion as it does. I think part of it is that they expect the week gap to loosen some of the memories in people's minds, like they forget who characters are so they can redefine them the next week. But we live in a society where it's very easy to just buy these episodes on iTunes, or go out and get the DVD set and binge watch, or wait for it to come on one of the streaming services and binge watch there. It's very unwise writing. You may be able to hook them in with the first episode, but unless you actually keep up that quality, or give people something every few weeks to tune back in for, you're not gonna land people for the long haul. And as I said, 12 or 13 episodes is not a particularly long season run, but you're not even gonna keep people for that if you don't have some sort of quality control, and that goes with consistency. You cannot just have all of these episodes so widely and wildly varying in quality, consistency, and characterization. It doesn't make sense, and it's not fulfilling for anyone. I've said it before when I was watching the other seasons of American Horror Story, and I'll say it again here. I want to have characters that are consistent between episodes and even in the same episode, but I don't have that here. That's a really important thing to have when you're trying to develop a character as the story goes. If a character just keeps stagnating, that's one thing. It's a failure of writing if you're trying to develop that character, but if you're not actually trying to develop the character and they're fine the way they are, then that's okay. Keep them consistent. But if you're trying to develop a character, you cannot just make them a different character in the next episode and think that that serves as development. There has to be a reason why they change. There has to be some reason for them to change and to shape what they turn into. Also, people don't tend to change like turning on a light switch. That rarely ever happens with any degree of permanence. Unfortunately, that happens all too often here, and while Freak Show, I maintain, is still better than Hotel, that's like saying at least it's not watching Gilbert Gottfried take a shit on the floor in real time. But speaking of shit, even as early as the start of episode 2, there were problems with quality writing. When you're a writer, it's tempting to leave out and forget some of the senses that aren't typically engaged by prose. You don't watch a movie and smell things from the movie. That's probably a good thing. But something to consider is the characters in the movie would smell things from the movie. I realize that it's a conceit of the masked slasher genre, because I've seen about 1 billion of those movies, not to notice the horrifying killer. But see, in those movies there's a reason why they can't pick out his scent distinctly from the things around them. In the toy store sequence at the beginning of episode 2, the only thing standing between a realization that this is unrealistic and sitting there calmly watching is the supreme indulgence of the audience. We've already seen that Twisty doesn't bathe. He constantly wears an unlaundered clown suit all around, visibly soiled. He carries bloodied things with him. Blood stinks. Especially as we are speaking of Florida in the 1950s, where, shock of shocks, they didn't have widespread central heating and air. It would be a disgusting scent that probably came off smelling like an abattoir. You don't just glide through something and not notice that. And honestly, that's just one of several instances where people are written as if they don't have all their senses. It's disturbing to me, especially when I'm watching something and I'm clearly supposed to not think about some aspect of it. I'm willing to go with you here, but you gotta give me something to work with. You gotta give me some concession as to why this is not gonna be a thing for the character. But it never comes. We never get that. That's just one of many examples where they just don't give us enough to say, okay, I'll go along with you. What's your idea? One thing the American Horror Story series is known for is introducing characters that don't have a lot of potential to do anything, go anywhere, or contribute anything useful to the narrative, and keeping them around way longer than people that actually could contribute to the narrative, who are underused in favor of the people that don't. This is so apparent in this one series. There are characters that are consistently, repeatedly, and all through their lives in this series relegated to the background, who could have contributed so much more than the characters we got introduced to that stuck around and did nothing. Most of the characters that we cared about or thought were neat got pathetically dispatched by something stupid, like Dandy. And, just like Dandy, characters that didn't actually add much to the story stayed around for fucking ever. To use an example, Dandy, as I've just mentioned. I know he's a character that's made to be a villain, he's a character meant to be hated, and he's built to be hated. But there's not much to him. He's not that interesting a character, he's not a complex character, and while he is portrayed skillfully, he doesn't actually add much of anything to the plot. It moves around him, it moves despite him, and it tries to build him up into something that, quite frankly, I don't believe. I don't buy it. I don't buy anything that he does. He was interesting enough when they were playing with the idea that he was fascinated with Twisty, but that didn't really go anywhere. They keep wanting to waffle between, I'm fascinated with the freak show, I want to be a serial killer, I'm an asshole. That's not really good villain building. It's not good character building in general. And he's around from the first episode to the last. Like the character of Del, for example, there's a more complex character that is generally well portrayed, but he's not a character that actually adds much of anything to it, and we are supposed to forget, between weeks, what he has done. They try and do this all the time. They define characters as fairly objectionable or outright awful, irredeemable people, and then a week or two later they try and define them as something different, as if the audience is supposed to care about someone they've already written off. I'm sorry, but when you go too far with a character, there's nothing that can redeem them. Maybe with real people in real life, but this isn't real life, and it's not even remotely realistic writing. When you're writing a character, it's not a good idea to introduce them as irredeemably awful. You go too far in defining a character as doing all these horrible things and being, in general, a very, very bad person. It is a very hard uphill battle for you to go back later in the story and say, oh, well, actually, and have the audience give two shits about what you're trying to do. Del was kind of like the poster child for that. They made him a big heavy early on, and I continued on watching thinking they would get rid of him fairly soon. But he stayed around just short of for fucking ever. Main characters were not immune to this either. The only reason why the twins were tolerable as long as they were was because it wasn't exactly certain what their circumstances were. Were they pitiable? Were they good people? Was one good and one not? You don't really know. They never really tell you. And by the end of it, you're sick of them. You're sick of the drama that surrounds them, and you're sick of them as characters. No offense meant to Sarah Paulson, who generally did a good job with the material she had, but the twins were assholes. And there was just nothing to relish about that. I mean, Elsa could be an asshole too, but there was an underlying charisma, an underlying likable quality, an underlying pathos, really, in the portrayal that makes Elsa so compelling and the twins so dull. But really, on that note, Elsa was probably the only character to get a specific character arc that we actually cared about. Most of the other characters they tried to develop, or started trying and then just gave up. It ended up being ultimately very disappointing and pretty offensive when they decided to just be done with so many of the characters, leaving only a very few remaining. And then of course we come to something that kind of bothers me. Something that's come up before in American Horror Story, and something that made me kind of think about it. Honestly, American Horror Story comes off to me as kind of homophobic. Like, I understand the 50s were not a particularly good time for gay people. But the thing about it is, there's this sort of dominant current of breeder mentality, and I don't mean breeder in the offensive sense of just referring to a straight person. I mean breeder as in babies are everything. Like, you don't have value as a person until you crapped out a kid with someone. That sort of thinking. I can understand in Murder House because, well, a lot actually revolved around that family, and the major plot also revolved around the fact that the wife was pregnant. It also was an examination of a family dynamic that was falling apart. It worked very well for that. Ever since then, though, it's been kind of problematic. I mean, I realize that these are issues that come up with people's relationships, but I'm not really looking for that in Freak Show, and I don't know who actually was. He keeps popping up in these series, and you have to kind of think, why is it exactly that hooking up and someone being pregnant or having kids is American Horror Story's version of happily ever after? And it's always the people who end up not actually being developed well. By the end of the series, you don't care about the people that end up hooked up with their little happy ever afters. Maybe that's part of the message, I don't know, but it kind of stuck in my craw that this isn't the first time that's happened. And it just gives me a skeevy feeling that no non-heterosexual character actually ends up in a good place in these stories. If anything, most of the time they're singled out for especially horrible punishment. And while I understand that the creators and some of the writers claim to be sympathetic, it doesn't really show in their writing or their work. You can claim all the things you want. You can give people beefcake and what I would call, under generally more competent writing, queerbaiting, but it doesn't amount to much if the underlying sentiment still feels homophobic. It's kind of like watching 300, which is something that I've criticized in the past, and saying, oh, this is a very pro-gay, gay-friendly film. No, it's very homophobic, but people somehow think it's gay-friendly because it's got a bunch of beefcake in it. Doesn't work that way, guys. That's actually called exploitation. When you put things in something so that people will come and patronize it, when in reality you're just trying to turn a profit off of them. And even if anybody associated with the production is gay, even if the entire cast is completely gay-friendly, that doesn't make the program gay-friendly. The content is really important. The writing, the development, that's very important. And I feel so often in American Horror Story that it's neglected in favor of how can we keep the audience from thinking about what they're watching? How can we keep them jumping in their seats? Most of the things that are actually scary, even remotely, are more startling, actually, or off-putting. It's the equivalent of unlimited, spring-loaded cat scares in a regular horror film. There's no actual build-up because they don't develop the characters or plot lines well. There are plenty of subplots and plenty of crisscrossing mazes of intrigue, but practically none of them go anywhere, and if they do go somewhere, it's so quick that you never could have expected it in the first place. It's a particular kind of setup for horror, but it's not a particularly good setup for horror. There's no actual suspense, it just makes the audience uncomfortable, and I don't think that's what horror is always about. Horror usually operates on a sense of revulsion, given, but when you just introduce a bunch of unlikable characters, or characters that are difficult to redeem, and you have maybe one or two characters the audience cares about which you ignore, that's not really a good recipe for excellent writing no matter what the genre. Regardless of what you're trying to do, you need to involve the audience in some way. Freakshow does not do this very well. We have a collection of a lot of characters interacting and the plot moving when it thinks it needs to, but not for any organic reason, and not to make any characters better, more sympathetic or more identifiable. Characters have flaws, but they don't actually add anything to the characters around them or themselves. They take away from all of the characters. Elsa's backstory, for example, is ludicrous and tends to lead nowhere except to set something up for later that seems like they just forgot about it and then remembered it at the last minute. I will say that the ending, the very ending at least, moved me and was great. It was possibly the best ending of any of the American Horror Story series to date. At the same time, it doesn't redeem all of those terrible episodes that you'll have to sit through to get there. There were some good musical performances because Jessica Lange is a good performer. There's watchable acting, watchable performances because the actors are good even if the material isn't. There's a lot to keep your eyes occupied. There's a lot to keep you from actually thinking about how not very good it is. But when you sit down, especially if you do like me and watch these episodes in rapid order, it occurs very quickly that it isn't very good. It's just not what it could have and should have been. One of the worst parts of American Horror Story in general is the introduction of far too many characters that go nowhere or actually don't contribute at all, as I've said before. As you may remember from my review of the first episode, the opener to the series presented just enough characters to develop and follow and enjoy. In the second episode, they started to introduce so many characters that were utterly extraneous at that point. They could have easily waited until much later in the series and actually introduced them organically, naturally, in a way that feels like we're not just introducing them because it's early on in the series and they want to get their face time. A little bit of self-control could lead to a much better story, because the way it feels from the way they present it is that they're pouring out all their toys early on, and they've got all these characters around, but they don't know what to do with a good level half of them, most of which are introduced immediately after the opener. It doesn't really matter if you've got the best actor in the world to play a character if the character goes nowhere. And it's especially noteworthy that if you have a character that's actually doing something with a decent actor, don't get rid of them before they actually contribute to the plot. It was nothing short of a tragedy that Frances Conroy's character was done away with barely halfway through the series. She had a lot to do in the time where she was a part of it, but that really only served to make us feel like she had more to contribute. Dandy is just not a deep or interesting enough character to hold our attention without the interaction with his mother, and his mother had more to interact with other people too. I think Elsa's story is the most compelling because, while she's imperfect and while she has done some terrible things, she's still interesting. One still wants to like her because, after a repeated series of tragedies, she's still going on and she's still trying to do her best, even though she feels like it may be too late for her to get her opportunity. She's in an unenviable position from the very beginning of the show, and even though she gets what she thinks she wants at the time, it's not something actually that turns out the way that she expects it. I did like that her life was literally in her hands, that finally she had the power that she had wanted before to decide on the direction of her life. I thought that was a nice touch. That was a good thing. Again, the David Bowie songs make it more poignant probably than it was when it was first broadcast. But overall, I agreed with that being kind of the finale, and it did move me. The ending was masterfully done. I could have done without the cut-ins of asshole characters I don't care about later in life, with some unknown leap of time, but, I'm just so disappointed by the poor use of good actors. Like Angela Bassett as Desiree. Desiree was an awful character from the beginning, but at least we knew what she was trying to do. She was poorly written, but Bassett did the best she could with the material. Then they had her ludicrous subplot that was supposed to be... I don't know what it was supposed to be, it was just awful. And it was also stupid in that, yet again, it was requiring the audience to take too much on faith. There was too much that fell apart if you even thought about it. The explanations just don't work. They're stupid, and ultimately meaningless. She has some funny lines, and occasionally she will contribute something to the story, but overall she's kind of a waste of time of a character. It's definitely a waste of time for the actress, who is honestly a lot better and deserves a lot better than the character of Desiree. The same is true with Jimmy the Lobster Boy. Evan Peters acts his heart out, but by the end of it, you just don't care about him. It's kind of like the twins. Sarah Paulson did a fine job acting them, and it was surely a challenging role, but you just don't care about them by the end. They're just not that compelling. Especially when you consider that other characters could have been developed and should have been developed, who were more likable, more interesting, and in general better written. But considering how things turned out, maybe if these characters were concentrated on, I'd be complaining about them instead of the ones that were concentrated on and developed to some level. They were inconsistent between episodes and sometimes in the same episode, but they were concentrated on and didn't turn out very well. Elsa is literally the only character that does turn out very well, but I think a large part of that was Jessica Lange's own charisma and what she brought to it. We honestly probably wouldn't care if, for example, Lady Gaga had portrayed Elsa Mars. While the whole tragedy in Tinseltown had its own kind of poetic appeal, in a way it didn't really fit either. I do like the ending, I do think the ending was beautiful, but the whole Hollywood thing, it seemed very much tacked on at the last moment. And all of the stuff about her ridiculous backstory I wish they would have forgotten just didn't actually make that much sense. It makes you, again, think about the reasons why that wouldn't work. The reasons why legally that wouldn't work, and the reasons why in terms of story, logic and reason it doesn't work. And this isn't even fridge logic. This is stuff that they're trying to stop you from thinking of while you're watching the show. Fridge logic is something that is generally so smoothly slid in that it has to take you out of it for you to realize what's going on. So when the commercials come up and you go to the fridge to get a snack, you might realize it because you're no longer in the spell of the world, you're no longer immersed in the story it's trying to tell, in the fabric of its tapestry. American Horror Story doesn't do that very well. You can be surrounded by its motif and its aesthetic and still realize that doesn't work, that doesn't make any sense, or that's stupid. Overall, I think Freak Show stands as almost the poster child of wasted potential. Coven almost got there, but it just didn't have enough potential to be so much wasted potential. Freak Show is one of those shows and one of those stories that could have been developed along different lines and given a kind of wonderful little pocket of horror into a horrifying, terrible decade and the decline of a sad world, which, again, the presentation made you ask some questions about the accuracy of the history and a lot of other things that were just problematic. But I understand, too, that it was meant to be a pastiche. It was meant to be a modern telling of something with the feel of a certain time period, not necessarily pinpoint accurate. That's how we have David Bowie songs in the 1950s and Fiona Apple being performed knowingly by someone who exists decades before she was born. I can get behind that, and that's okay. I can be just as harsh with things I like. I'm not going to say that every film made by Dario Argento was a masterpiece. In fact, I'd say that most of them are not. But when I enjoy Suspiria, for example, or Inferno, I admit that they do have dream logic in them. A lot of the characters don't get the kind of development that I would like, but at the same time, these are feature films. They're not series that have literally 12, 13 hours to work with. They have to present a character as compellingly as possible and a situation that resolves itself within usually about 2 hours. The way they go about that shapes the entire experience for me. That's how I can say that watching the first episode of Freak Show feels like a very good film in and of itself. If it had started and ended there, or just done that episode and then a second episode to deal with all the rest, that would have been fine. Too much of American Horror Story, and especially Freak Show, feels like a whole lot of nothing. There's so much wasted time in the middle here, and I know I've said specifically waste of time before, but this really hits it home. There's so much time wasting, there's so much nothing, there's so much fiddle farting around that nothing happens, but you could have used that time to develop characters meaningfully, instead of either throwing them under a bus when you thought you needed a thrill, or just redefining them as something else in the next episode. It all seems like such wasted potential. There could have and should have been so much more here. Some of the characters have such great chemistry that's hardly ever explored or done anything with. It really is a shame. They did some better things in previous series and even more daring things. When Freak Show gets outrageous, it's offensive and stupid. When it tries to play it safe, it's just boring nothing. And there are plenty of points where I'm sure it was supposed to be dramatic or moving, but it just ends up seeming comical, campy or overacted or underacted even. I'm a big lover of camp, and I don't see it where a lot of other people see it. In some of the other series, I missed it. But in Freak Show, there's not enough finesse outside of the first episode, really, and so things tend towards the camp side of things, at best, and towards the unpleasantly uncomfortable at worst. With horror, you do sometimes want to make your audience uncomfortable, but having a crapsack world filled with characters you don't care about just makes the audience not want to be around them and not want to watch the show. That's a failure of a show. That's a failure of writing. Part of what makes horror scary and tense is that you care about, or ideally should care about, enough of the characters to be invested in their well-being. The only one that actually manages to pull that off is Elsa, because most of the other characters we actually care about are either done away with far too early in the story, or end up becoming completely different people. It's a shame, but that's American Horror Story for you. So what did you think? Comment below, leave me your thoughts. I'd love to hear them. And again, check out the blurb, click on the read more, check out all the links. I've got a great series called Occultist, which is about paranormal investigators that are hot guys. You might enjoy it. Follow me on social media, subscribe to my channel here, become a patron on Patreon. It's the best way to help me out. And there's also plenty of extra bonuses for patrons. I'll be glad for the help. So until next time, I'm Hushjaw, and I'll probably still be Hushjaw next time too. Take care. Thanks for listening. Bye.